Welcome to the case of the Taxidermist's Testament, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series Sherlock Holmes, the Sussex Apocrypha, playing in the year 1909. Though many of my friend's adventures are known to the public, a private ledger from his retirement in Sussex has only recently come to light. Within its coded pages, I have found accounts of cases he deemed too strange or sensitive for publication. Mysteries revealing a more contemplative Holmes grappling with the changing world. Allow me to begin my account with a most peculiar affair from the summer of 1909, a matter which Holmes recorded under the title, The Case of the Taxidermist's Testament. Chapter 1. The summer of 1909 had settled upon the Sussex Downs with a deep and heavy warmth. From the open window of our sitting-room, the air carried not the scent of London's coal smoke, but the sweet perfume of clover. The only sounds were the distant bleating of sheep and the low, contented hum of my friend's apiary. Holmes, in his retirement, had taken to the study of bees with the same ferocious intensity he had once reserved for the criminal underworld. He was bent over his microscope, his long back curved in concentration, the only movement, the slight, precise turn of a brass knob. The afternoon's placid spell was broken by the sharp crunch of hurried footsteps on the gravel path outside, a sound of distinct urgency. The door to the sitting-room opened with a soft click. Our good housekeeper, Martha Hudson, stood on the threshold, her bonnet slightly askew and a flush of exertion on her cheeks. She clutched a long, stiff envelope in one hand, as if it were a talisman against some unseen trouble. "You have not come to consult me on the price of butter, Mrs. Hudson. Your pace was too brisk for a simple errand, and the manner in which you guard that document suggests a matter of some legal weight," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He had not even turned from his instrument. I heard the faint scrape of a glass slide being adjusted under the lens. Even after all our years together, the sheer speed of his deductions could still take my breath away. His observation was, as ever, unerringly precise. Mrs. Hudson gave a slight start, her breath catching in a small gasp of surprise that was quite audible in the quiet room. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, how do you always—" "Never mind, there's no time. It's about Mr. Blackwood, old Ephraim Blackwood, the taxidermist from the village. He passed on 2 days ago," replied Martha Hudson. Holmes at last straightened up with a soft creak of his chair, his keen grey eyes fixing upon Mrs. Hudson. With a graceful sweep of his hand he gestured to the armchair opposite his own. The man was not well liked, if village rumour is to be credited. A recluse with a sour disposition. His passing is unlikely to have caused widespread mourning. "What is it about his departure that brings you here in such a state?" stated Sherlock Holmes. Mrs. Hudson took the offered seat, the fabric of her apron rustling as she smoothed it over her lap. Her voice lowered as she recounted the news. "It's his will, sir. A proper scandal it is. He'd no wife nor chick nor child, just that nephew from London who couldn't stand the sight of him. We all assumed the fellow, a Mr. Asquith, would get the cottage. But the will was read this morning, and it's the queerest bit of writing I've ever laid eyes on," replied Martha Hudson. She carefully placed the envelope upon the table between us, the stiff paper making a soft thud on the polished wood. It was a copy, transcribed in a neat clerical hand. My own curiosity was now thoroughly piqued. Holmes reached for it, his long fingers unfolding the document with a sharp, crisp rustle that seemed to command the room's attention. "And what is so strange about it?" Sherlock Holmes noted. "He's left the lot, the house, the workshop, his savings, to someone who isn't even named. It's a riddle, Mr. Holmes, a proper puzzle. The nephew is furious, of course, shouting to all and sundry that the old man was mad and the will should be thrown out," Martha Hudson said. My friend's eyes scanned the document. A flicker of interest, the first I had seen all day, displaced the languor that had possessed him. I saw the familiar spark ignite within their depths. The hunter had caught a scent. "Indeed. Listen to this, Watson. I, Ephraim Blackwood, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath my entire worldly estate not to those who share my blood but not my spirit, but to the one soul in this parish, who understands the silent work of the sexton beetle, and knows the true perch of the nightjar." "A peculiar bequest, to be sure," observed Sherlock Holmes. He read the words aloud, his voice crisp and analytical. "I confess the phrases meant little to me, invoking the grim labours of a burying beetle and the nocturnal habits of a bird. The words seemed utterly bizarre, hanging there in the air. Motes of dust danced in the sunbeams slanting from the window, and from outside, the gentle hum of the bees continued, a peaceful counterpoint to the strangeness of the bequest. "That nephew of his is crying madman to anyone who'll listen. But I knew Mr. Blackwood, not well, mind you, but I knew him. A sour tongue he had, for certain, but his mind was as sharp as any of his own pins. There's sense in those words, Mr. Holmes. I feel it in my bones." "It ain't right his last wishes get tossed aside like rubbish," said Martha Hudson. Holmes placed the paper down and steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling. The only sound in the room was the slow, deliberate tick of the mantel clock. I watched him, my mind turning over the strange riddle. The silence stretched, amplified by the ticking and the faint, distant buzzing from the apiary. For a full minute he said nothing. Then, a thin smile touched his lips. Insanity is a convenient label for that which we do not understand. A man who spent his life in the meticulous study of nature's laws is unlikely to abandon logic at its end. This is not the rambling of a broken mind, Watson. It is a puzzle, a test, constructed by a man who valued knowledge of the natural world above all else, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He rose from his chair, his lethargy completely vanished. A wiry electric energy that I knew so well now animated his every lineament. A thrill went through me. The game, it seemed, was afoot once more. He began to pace before the hearth, his weight causing the old floorboards to groan faintly with each turn. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. You were right to bring this to me. The law may see a challenge to a will. I see a challenge to the intellect. We shall look into it. Watson, tomorrow we shall pay a visit to the late Mr. Blackwood's workshop. I wish to see the world that this peculiar testator inhabited. Perhaps a conversation with our local physician, Dr. Reed, would also be in order," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Our boots crunched on the gravel path as Dr. Alistair Reed, a local physician of quiet intelligence whom Holmes knew from a prior case, led us towards a squat, flint-walled cottage. It stood apart from the village, looking sullen and withdrawn, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. I found Reed's observations on the local flora as keen as any medical diagnosis. "This is the place. Ephraim Blackwood's workshop." "He was not a man for visitors, I'm afraid. The village thought him quite mad," Dr. Alistair Reed answered, as Reed pushed open the heavy oak door. A small, tarnished brass bell jangled discordantly. The sound seemed to startle even the dust motes dancing in a single shaft of sunlight from the grimy skylight above. The air that met us was a formidable assault, a thick chemical miasma of camphor and arsenic that caught in my own throat, layered over the dry scent of aged wood and feathers. A profound silence hung within, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, and then I saw them. From every wall and shelf, the glass eyes of 100 creatures watched our intrusion, their stillness an unnerving mockery of life. "And what is the meaning of this intrusion?" "The man is dead. Is his property not to be left in peace?" replied Mr. Jonas Asquith. From the shadows, the sharp tap of polished leather on dusty floorboards announced a man utterly incongruous in this rustic tomb. His city suit was dark, his face pale and pinched, his entire demeanour radiating an impatient energy. This, I surmised, could only be the nephew, Mr. Jonas Asquith. "I am Sherlock Holmes. I am here to examine the late Mr. Blackwood's effects in connection with his last will and testament," Sherlock Holmes noted. "His testament? The ravings of a lunatic. Look at this place. A lifetime wasted collecting and stuffing vermin. And for what? To leave his fortune to a riddle. Bah! The whole thing will be invalidated. Then I shall have this land cleared, mark my words," answered Mr. Jonas Asquith. He gestured dismissively towards the window. Through the grimy pane I could see the rolling green expanse of the South Downs, beautiful even under the grey sky. All this empty country, utterly wasted, its land that could be put to proper, profitable use. But that requires a modern mind, not one lost in sentiment and folklore. Mr. Jonas Asquith answered. I saw Holmes's gaze flicker towards the man for a brief, sharp instant. A look of intense calculation I knew well. In his greedy diatribe, Asquith had just handed my friend a vital piece of the puzzle. Entirely oblivious, the nephew soon made his excuses and departed, the bell jangling his exit with the same jarring abruptness as his arrival. A grasping fellow. He never visited his uncle in life, responded Dr. Alistair Reed. Reed murmured the words only after the sharp crunch of the man's footsteps faded on the path outside. He has provided us with his motive, at any rate. But he is wrong about one thing. This is not the collection of a lunatic. Observe, gentlemen. Look here. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His long fingers tapped lightly on the glass of a display case, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He indicated a case of butterflies. To my eye, it was a pleasant but random assortment, a chalk-hill blue, a silver-studded specimen, a common heath moth, with no apparent scientific reason for their grouping. There is no taxonomic logic here. A lepidopterist would group them by family. But Blackwood has not. Instead, he has placed a sprig of dried wild thyme beside them. And here, he moved to a stoat posed as if in motion. Beside it, a piece of flint, with a fossilized sea urchin embedded within. This is not a collection, gentlemen. It is a map, declared Sherlock Holmes. He straightened up, and I saw the familiar, keen glint in his eyes. It was the look of the hunter upon the trail, and I felt the thrill of the chase rise in my own chest. He has charted the very land his nephew despises. Each specimen is a landmark. The riddle of the will is the key, but this room is the chart itself. To read it, we must first understand the cartographer. We must learn of Blackwood's own history upon these downs. Leaving the oppressive quiet of the taxidermist's shop behind us, Holmes set a brisk pace towards the village green. The air, fresh with the scent of cut grass and damp earth, was a welcome tonic. The hostility of Mr. Asquith had left a sour taste, and the puzzle of the will seemed to grow more complex with every passing moment. After the chill of that house, I confess I hoped our next stop was the London train. "Where are we bound, Holmes?" wondered Dr. John Watson. "On the contrary, Watson. A man is not an island, particularly not in a village this small. Mr. Blackwood lived here for over 60 years. To understand the logic of his final act, we must first understand the logic of his life. His nephew sees only a madman, but madness is rarely so methodical. We are going to listen to the echoes of the past," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Our destination proved to be the local public house, the Shepherd's Crook. The heavy oak door groaned shut behind us, cutting off the rhythmic creak of the sign outside. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of pipe smoke and spilled ale. A low murmur of conversation from a corner near the hearth sputtered into silence as we entered. The only remaining sounds, the crackle of the fire and the slow tick of a grandfather clock. Holmes, with the disarming geniality he could summon at will, ordered 2 lemonades from the publican. The scrape of our chairs on the stone floor drew a few sideways glances as he steered me towards the corner where the old men sat. It took little time for him to turn the conversation to the subject of the late Mr. Blackwood. The initial responses were gruff, punctuated by the clink of a tankard set down hard on the table. "Ephraim? Strange as they come, sir. Always was. Even as a lad he'd be off on the downs for days, not speaking to a soul. Cared more for a dead badger than for his own kin, he did." First villager said. Another man, nursing a clay pipe, took a long, slow draw, the embers glowing like a firefly in the dim light. He exhaled a plume of smoke before speaking. his voice a dry rasp. "Aye, that's the truth of it. He had the sight, he did. Not for spirits, mind you, but for the birds and the beasts. Knew their calls, their nests, every last habit. A passion, some might call it. An obsession, others would say. Depends on your view of things," remarked second villager. Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes darting from face to face. His voice, low and encouraging, drew out their stories like a fisherman reeling in his catch. As he listened, far more than he spoke, a portrait emerged. Blackwood, a reclusive, misunderstood genius who spoke the language of the natural world fluently, but stumbled over the simplest human interactions. Then came the remark that altered the case. It was offered casually by the publican, the rhythmic swish of his damp cloth on our table, a mundane counterpoint to the sudden revelation. "Well, if you want the oddest thing. It was them old tracks. Pilgrim routes, he'd call them, tapping his nose like it was a grand secret. Said the old ways across the downs weren't just random footpaths, but followed the very bones of the land. Spent a whole summer tracing one, he did, right from the Weald to the sea. Claimed he found it on some ancient map," responded the publican. I saw a flicker in Holmes's eyes, a sudden, intense focus that I knew so well. He had found his thread. The talk of wildlife had been mere confirmation of Blackwood's character, but this was different. A man who traced ancient hidden paths across the landscape was a man who appreciated hidden logic, patterns invisible to the common eye. A man of systems, Watson. A man who understands that the most logical path is not always the most obvious one, explained Sherlock Holmes. He placed a few coins on the table. Their sharp clink, cutting through the low murmur of the room. The legs of his chair scraped loudly against the flagstones as he stood abruptly, his energy renewed, his purpose clear. "Come, my dear fellow. The living have told us what they know. It is time to return and ask the dead for their secrets. To that silent menagerie we go. The answer to the riddle is not in the fields, but in the way Mr. Blackwood chose to preserve them," deduced Sherlock Holmes. The revelation of Blackwood's interest in the old pilgrim ways had sent my mind wandering, but Holmes had already filed the fact away. The following morning found us not on some ancient footpath, but back within the funereal stillness of the taxidermist's workshop. The air hung heavy with the chemical scent of preservation. It muffled the sounds of the village beyond, enveloping us in a silent realm of glass eyes and frozen postures. "The past has its uses, Watson, but the present holds the key. The riddle is our map, and it does not point to the roads of ancient Sussex, it points to this room." Sherlock Holmes responded. He paced before the rows of specimens, his hands clasped behind his back. With us was Dr. Reed, the local physician whose knowledge of the region's flora and fauna Holmes had deemed essential. The doctor stood observing my friend with a look of quiet curiosity. Where the silent singer keeps its watch. A paradox, is it not? The singer that is, by its nature, silent. Every bird in this room is silent, yet the riddle specifies one. His gaze, sharp and penetrating, swept across the owls and kestrels, dismissing them with a glance. He took a few steps, his boots echoing softly on the bare floorboards, and stopped before a large case against the far wall. It contained dozens of smaller birds perched on a mock tree. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight that pierced the gloom, illuminating the silent assembly. The floorboards gave a final, low groan under his weight as he leaned closer to the glass. "Dr. Reed, you knew Blackwood's work. Would you describe him as a meticulous man?" "Meticulous to a fault, Mr. Holmes. His attention to detail was legendary, though not always appreciated. Why, he'd spend a week setting a single feather if it didn't meet his exacting standards," responded Dr. Alistair Reed. "Precisely. Then would a man so dedicated to accuracy make a simple error in classification?" "Observe," declared Sherlock Holmes. He pointed a long, decisive finger at one of the smaller specimens. It was a handsome little creature with a grey head, chestnut back, and a fierce black mask across its eyes. Beneath its perch, a small, neatly typed label read, Fringilla coelebs. Dr. Reed stepped forward, producing a pair of spectacles from his waistcoat. He polished them quickly with a handkerchief, before placing them on his nose, his brow furrowed as he peered through the dusty glass. Good heavens! That is no chaffinch. The hooked beak, the plumage, it is utterly unmistakable. That, sir, is a red-backed shrike, replied Dr. Alistair Reed. A thin smile played upon Holmes's lips. He had not moved, yet the entire energy of the room seemed to pivot around him. The discovery was made. A shrike. "And does this shrike sing, Doctor?" declared Sherlock Holmes. "It has a call, certainly, but it is harsh and grating." "It is no songbird, it is a predator," replied Dr. Alistair Reed. "A silent singer, then. A bird known for its voice being anything but melodious. And tell me, does this particular predator have any local name, a title born of country folklore?" stated Sherlock Holmes. Dr. Reed nodded, his expression turning thoughtful. "Yes. A rather grim one. For its habit of impaling its prey, insects, beetles, even small lizards, upon thorns to create a larder, the country folk have long called it the butcher bird," answered Dr. Alistair Reed. "This was no error, Watson. It was a signpost, left by one scientist for another. A butcher bird, a fitting emblem for a man who felt he must act ruthlessly to protect his work," replied Sherlock Holmes. The words hung in the dusty air. Holmes turned from the case, his eyes alight with the fire of the chase. The riddle was yielding its secrets, not of treasure, but of a hidden life. Blackwood was not merely preserving nature, he was documenting its decline. We must now discover the nature of that work, and with whom he shared it. "His academic correspondence is our next port of call," remarked Sherlock Holmes. The identification of the red-backed shrike had kindled a new and urgent fire in my friend, his grey eyes glinting with the fervour of the hunt. The peculiar name Dr. Reed had given it, the butcher bird, seemed to echo in Holmes's mind, and he spent the remainder of the evening in a profound, smoke-wreathed silence. By morning, however, his lethargy had vanished, replaced by a familiar, sharp-edged energy. He had located, amongst Blackwood's dusty papers, a thin sheaf of correspondence with a Professor James Morley of the University of London. "Watson, our investigation must leave the country lanes for the city's cloisters. A man like Blackwood, whose knowledge was so specialized, would surely have an academic counterpart. It is in the very heart of established science that we shall find the shadow of our reclusive taxidermist," explained Sherlock Holmes. And so it was that a few hours later we found ourselves stepping from the clamour of a hansom cab into the comparative peace of the university grounds. The city's ceaseless roar gave way to a scholarly hush. The air, though still tinged with the metallic tang of London's coal smoke, carried a different scent here, one of damp stone, old leather from the libraries, and freshly cut grass from the quadrangles. The crunch of our boots on the gravel path seemed a coarse intrusion upon the studious quiet. Professor Morley's office was a cramped space, perched high in a stone tower overlooking a green quadrangle. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, struggled through a grimy arched window. The man himself was small and bird-like, with spectacles that seemed to magnify not only his eyes, but also his perpetual state of anxiety. The room was cluttered with stacks of journals threatening to collapse, a half-dissected starling under a bell jar, and everywhere the scent of old paper, and a faint, acrid chemical preservative. He peered at us over a mountain of books as we entered. "Professor Morley. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. I believe you are acquainted with the late Mr. Ephraim Blackwood of Sussex," Sherlock Holmes noted. At the mention of the name, the professor's shoulders tightened. He gestured for us to sit, the legs of the wooden chairs scraping noisily against the bare floorboards. Ah, yes, Blackwood. A difficult man, to be sure, but a great loss to field observation. A true loss. His specimens were second to none. A hermit, of course, but his eye for detail, quite remarkable. Quite, said Professor James Morley. His praise was genuine, yet his voice was thin, as if stretched by some unseen tension. We are interested less in his past contributions, Professor, and more in your recent joint venture. The Ecological Survey of the Ashdown Marshlands, Sherlock Holmes said. A sheaf of loose papers slid from a stack on Morley's desk, scattering across the floor with a dry rustle. He made no move to retrieve them. A deep flush rose from his collar. That? Good heavens, that was merely a notion. A preliminary study, nothing more. It did not proceed. The university has other, more pressing priorities for its funding. Budgets, you understand. Administrative matters. Entirely out of my hands, I assure you, Professor James Morley said. I see. And was Mr. Jonas Asquith's development company, by chance, involved in setting these new priorities? Sherlock Holmes pointed out. The question, delivered in a deceptively mild tone, struck the professor like a physical blow. He shot to his feet, his chair clattering backwards. I have a lecture to attend. It would be most improper for me to discuss the university's benefactors. I assure you, gentlemen, I have told you all I know. Now, if you'll excuse me, good day to you both. Professor James Morley said. The heavy oak door closed behind us with a final thud. As we walked back across the quadrangle, the chime of the chapel bell seemed louder, the laughter of students passing with books under their arms more carefree. The scent of cut grass and old stone felt clean after the stale air of the professor's tower. Yet I was convinced we had reached a proper dead end. Well, Holmes, that was a fruitless errand, was it not? The man was clearly terrified, but he told us precisely nothing of substance, Dr. John Watson added. On the contrary, Watson, he told us everything. His fear was the most eloquent confession. Did you not notice the glossy prospectus lying open upon his desk? Amidst the academic clutter, it was the one item that was pristine, replied Sherlock Holmes. I confessed, feeling rather obtuse, that I had not paid it much heed. It was turned to the page listing the patrons of the new science wing. The primary donor, in bold lettering, was Asquith & Sons Development, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Asquith, the very man buying up the marshland, commented Dr. John Watson. Precisely. Morley and Blackwood were preparing a report on the unique ecology of that same land. The university, beholden to Asquith's checkbook, stonewalled the project. The professor was forced into silence to protect his career, Sherlock Holmes said. The sheer, cold logic of it was breathtaking. It was not academic disagreement that had halted the work, but the chilling, silent influence of money. Blackwood, however, was a man free of such institutional chains. He would not be silenced so easily. He has hidden his findings, Watson, and the key is the bird. We have the silent singer. Now we must consider its grim nickname, the butcher bird. What, Watson, is the butcher's coat? Observed Sherlock Holmes. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was a steady counterpoint to my own unsettled thoughts, as our train rattled back towards the Sussex countryside. The scent of coal smoke and hot metal hung in the air of the carriage. Dr. Reed, who had joined us, shared my view that we had reached an impasse. Holmes, however, was of a different mind. He had been unnervingly silent for the better part of an hour, his long fingers steepled before him, his eyes closed. Then, as the spire of the village church pierced the horizon, he suddenly sat bolt upright. The butcher's coat! My dear fellows, it is astonishingly simple. We have been looking for a man when we should have been looking for a bird, observed Sherlock Holmes. A bird? Holmes, have you taken leave of your senses? We are searching for an heir. This is no time for ornithological whimsy, Dr. John Watson inquired. I must concur with Dr. Watson. From a legal standpoint, suggesting the beneficiary is an animal would only strengthen the family's case for insanity. What logic could possibly support such a conclusion? Dr. Alistair Reed replied. Holmes was already on his feet. His lethargy vanished and replaced by that familiar, predatory energy I knew so well. We alighted from the carriage and strode directly to the late taxidermist's shop. The quiet of the village street was broken only by the crunch of our boots on the gravel path. Dr. Reed turned his own key in the lock, the sound of the tumblers grating loudly in the stillness. The door swung inward with a prolonged creak, releasing a potent, layered scent of formaldehyde, cedar, and the dry, papery smell of ages. The red-backed shrike. Reed. What is its common name amongst the country folk? What do they call the bird that impales its larder upon thorns? Replied Sherlock Holmes. Dr. Reed stopped short, his hand frozen on the door latch. In the dim light filtering through the grimy shop window, dust motes danced like frantic sprites, illuminating the silent, glassy-eyed audience that surrounded us. Good heavens! The butcher bird, of course. Its grey head and chestnut back. Why, it truly does wear a butcher's coat, Dr. Alistair Reed replied. By Jove, Holmes! A riddle of natural history. It's precisely the kind of thing a man like Blackwood would devise, responded Dr. John Watson. Holmes offered a curt nod. His keen eyes swept across the dusty shelves as he strode purposefully through the shop, each footstep a muffled echo on the bare wooden floor. He did not pause at the grand eagles or the foxes snarling in their glass cases, but made straight for a modest display in a far corner. There, perched upon a synthetic branch, was the very bird in question. Blackwood was a man of meticulous habits and singular focus. The riddle was not a flight of fancy, it was a signpost. He pointed not to the most valuable specimen, but to the most significant. Reed adduced Sherlock Holmes. He lifted the specimen carefully. It felt surprisingly weighty in his hands, anchored by its simple, dark-stained wooden plinth. To my eye, it seemed perfectly ordinary, yet Holmes turned it over and over, his examination intense. He produced his pocket lens and bent low, his entire being concentrated upon the underside of the base. A low hiss of satisfaction escaped his lips, as I suspected. Our man was a craftsman in more than just feathers and skin. Observe, Reed, the join here is almost imperceptible, but the grain of the wood runs contrary to the main block. He drew a small penknife from his pocket and inserted the tip into the hairline crack he had indicated. With a gentle pressure and a faint dry snap of old wood, a small section of the base sprang open on a tiny tarnished brass hinge. A faint scent of cedar and dry velvet escaped the newly revealed cavity. Ingenious! The joinery is masterful. I would never have spotted it, answered Dr. Alistair Reed. But the compartment did not contain a revised will, nor a letter of confession. Nestled in the faded velvet was only a single object, a heavy, ornate key of tarnished brass. A key? But to what? There is no mark upon it, no clue as to the lock it might fit, commented Dr. John Watson. Holmes picked it up, weighing it in his palm, a thoughtful, almost triumphant expression on his face, as if my question had merely voiced the next step in his own thoughts. This, gentlemen, is not the end of the trail, but the beginning of a new one. Blackwood leads us from a riddle of nature to a puzzle of man's world. This key, I have no doubt, is for a lockbox. Our hunt moves from the fields of Sussex to the vaults of Lewis. The game, as they say, is afoot, Sherlock Holmes responded. The small, brass key felt weighty with significance as our trap rattled along the lane towards Lewis. Dr. Reed sat opposite us, his usual placid demeanour tinged with a quiet excitement, whilst Holmes stared intently at the object in his palm. The rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves and the groan of the trap's axles were the only sounds, save for the occasional cry of a distant skylark. His voice was steady, cutting through the country quiet. Knowing Blackwood's penchant for the old ways, I'd wager on Finch and Sons in Lewes. They're a veritable institution, as rooted in this soil as the oldest oaks, responded Dr. Alistair Reed. Precisely, my dear Reed, Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His eyes glinted with anticipation as he continued. A man like Blackwood, steeped in tradition, would not entrust his affairs to some new-fangled establishment. No, he would seek out the firm with the deepest roots and the most dust. Sherlock Holmes responded. The solicitor's office was indeed a place of dust and shadowed corners, the air thick with the scent of old paper and sealing wax. A bell on the door announced our arrival with a thin, reedy jangle. A tall, desiccated man greeted us. Mr. Holmes, I am Finch. Your wire mentioned the late Mr. Blackwood. Most irregular. This way, answered Mr. Finch. His voice was as dry as the parchment stacked high on his desk. He led us across creaking floorboards to a vault in the back, the heavy iron door groaning in protest as he opened it. He located the box with little trouble. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying click, and Holmes lifted the heavy lid. I leaned forward, my heart thumping with anticipation. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay not a will, nor deeds, nor a fortune in bonds, but a small, leather-bound diary. Good heavens! Is that all? A diary? Dr. John Watson said. Holmes picked it up without a word. He opened it to find its pages entirely, disappointingly blank. Beneath it lay a single, dried edelweiss, pressed long ago. Nothing more. A soft sigh of deflation escaped Reed's lips. An empty journal and an edelweiss. A flower of the high Alps. Curious. It speaks of a memory, certainly, but not of an inheritance. A misstep, I fear, responded Dr. Alistair Reed. Mr. Finch simply shrugged, a dry rustle of his starched collar, the only sound of his opinion. But Holmes did not appear disheartened. On the contrary, a flicker of something, not triumph, but intense understanding, lit his eyes. He closed the box with a gentle snap. I must confess, Holmes, I am at a loss. A wild goose chase, it would seem, a cruel final jest from a lonely man, replied Dr. Alistair Reed. Patience, Doctor. I have seen Holmes confront walls far more blank than an empty diary, asked Dr. John Watson. The familiar comfort of Holmes's Sussex cottage enveloped us, the scent of his chemical experiments faintly perfuming the air. Holmes had been pacing before the hearth, his long fingers steepled before him, while Reed and I waited in expectant silence. At last he halted abruptly and turned to face us. It is not a dead end, Watson. It is a signpost, and it points away from the very road we have been travelling. Consider Ephraim Blackwood, a man of meticulous habits, a craftsman of unparalleled precision. Would such a man construct an elaborate puzzle, a riddle based on the red-backed shrike, hide a key in a secret compartment, only for it to lead to an empty diary? Declared Sherlock Holmes. It seems an act of madness or a cruel practical joke, I ventured. Dr. John Watson replied. Neither. It is an act of brilliant filtration, he declared, his tone rising with intellectual fervor. This was never about a physical inheritance. The key, the box, they're a magnificent red herring. A false door designed to trap the greedy and the conventional, such as our friend Mr. Asquith. He would find this box and declare his uncle insane, proving himself unworthy of the true prize, stated Sherlock Holmes. A log shifted and crackled in the fireplace, sending a cascade of bright sparks up the chimney. The pieces began to fall into place in my own mind. Blackwood's legacy is not something to be kept in a vault. It is knowledge, a lifetime of observation, a unique understanding of the natural world he so cherished. The will was a test, Watson, to find a mind that could appreciate it. Not a lawyer, not a banker, and certainly not a grasping nephew, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He turned from the fire, his gaze piercing. A naturalist, he said, the words sharp with certainty. Think, Watson. Remember Vicar Morley's peculiar evasiveness when we asked about Blackwood's interest in new voices? He was hiding something, not out of malice but perhaps out of a misplaced sense of duty to a parishioner's secret, replied Sherlock Holmes. The connection clicked into place with the force of a revelation. Morley's discomfort had not been about Blackwood's sanity, but about his secrets. Blackwood was seeking a successor, he continued, his expression one of newfound urgency. Someone who could carry on his work. The question is no longer what the key unlocks, but for whom the riddle was truly written. We must find this heir, Reed, and quickly, before the courts dismiss Blackwood's final, remarkable testament as the ramblings of a madman, stated Sherlock Holmes. Our search for the mysterious naturalist, born from Holmes's sudden insight, led us not to a dusty university office, but to the windswept expanse of the South Downs. The crunch of our boots on the chalk path gave way to the whisper of long grass. A small wooden hut stood sentinel over a valley, the air alive with the drone of bees and the sharp, lonely cry of a kestrel circling high above. This, we had learned, was the field station of a Miss Emily Fairfax. We found her crouched over a drawing board, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was a young woman, her attire practical and her hands stained with earth and ink. She looked up as our shadows fell across her work, her eyes, though tired, possessing a keen and intelligent light. Her initial greeting was wary, a coolly polite inquiry as to our business. Holmes removed his hat. Miss Fairfax, I presume? Sherlock Holmes, at your service. I've come to discuss a matter concerning the late Mr. Ephraim Blackwood, Sherlock Holmes said. He employed a tone of gentle respect I had seldom heard him use. Her posture stiffened. I failed to see what connection I could have with that gentleman, or what business it is of yours, Miss Emily Fairfax replied. Her voice, though quiet, held a steely resolve. The connection is a shared passion for the truth of this landscape. A truth Mr. Blackwood sought to preserve, and which he entrusted to a successor who would understand its value beyond mere pounds and shillings. He believed that successor was you, replied Sherlock Holmes. A gust of wind rattled the hut's single window pane, a lonely sound in the sudden silence. Holmes did not press, instead letting his gaze sweep the meticulously pinned insect specimens and detailed botanical drawings that lined the walls. Finally, her defensive shield seemed to fracture. A long sigh escaped her lips, and she gestured to a pair of simple wooden stools. He was more than a taxidermist. He was my mentor. He saw the value in my work when the Royal Society saw only a woman meddling where she ought not. We both saw the threat, replied Miss Emily Fairfax. Her voice was now softer, filled with a remembered warmth. The threat? Dr. John Watson said. Her expression hardened as she replied, tapping a finger on a large, hand-drawn map of the Downs pinned to the wall beside her. Surveyors. Men with theodolites and measuring chains, mapping the old ways for a new railway spur. Ephraim saw them weeks ago, near the ancient chalk pits. He believed his nephew, Jonas Asquith, was behind it, an attempt to exploit the land for its lime deposits. He got the name of their firm for me, Hadley & Sons Geodetics, answered Miss Emily Fairfax. As she spoke, Holmes had risen and moved silently to the hut's open doorway, his eyes fixed not on the view, but on a patch of wild thyme just beyond the threshold. They have been here more recently than weeks ago, Miss Fairfax. Someone has been observing you. There is a trampled area here behind this gorse bush, and I find on the ground the stub of a cheroot, a brand favoured in the London clubs, not by Sussex shepherds. Sherlock Holmes noted. His voice was low and grave. A flicker of fear crossed her face, but was swiftly replaced by determination. Then we must act quickly. Ephraim's work must not be for nothing, Miss Emily Fairfax said. The village post office greeted us with the pungent aroma of sealing wax and twine. As we entered, the staccato rhythm of the telegraph machine punctuated the air. Holmes strode purposefully to the counter, proffering a carefully penned message to the waiting clerk. His message was brief, addressed to the one man in England whose knowledge of the government's labyrinthine corridors was unparalleled. That evening the setting sun painted the downs in hues of bruised purple and orange. Back in our temporary lodgings a profound quiet had settled, broken only by the hiss and crackle of the hearth fire. The scent of wood smoke and old paper filled the small parlour. A cool breeze, carrying the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers, rustled the ivy against the window pane. On the mantel, beside the steadily ticking clock, sat the taxidermied shrike, its glass eyes seeming to watch as Holmes paced before the flames, a caged tiger of restless energy. "Do you believe Mycroft can truly connect Hadley and Sons to Asquith?" wondered Dr. John Watson. Holmes stopped his pacing, turning the poker over in his hands. The firelight glinted off the steel, but his gaze was distant, fixed on the shadows in the corner of the room. If a whisper of it exists in a government file, a shipping manifest or a company ledger, Mycroft will find it. "All we can do now, Watson, is wait," explained Sherlock Holmes. As dawn broke over the Sussex Downs, Mycroft's reply arrived with the morning's milk, a crisp telegram that lay upon our breakfast table like a death warrant. Its message was as brief as it was damning. Holmes read it aloud, his voice devoid of any surprise, yet carrying the cold weight of certainty. The financial backing for the surveyors, and their proposed railway, came from a holding company, whose sole director was Mr. Jonas Asquith. So, Watson, the greedy nephew is the predator in his own right. His challenge to the will is not merely avarice, but a strategic maneuver to clear the path for his own industrial ambitions, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He folded the telegram with sharp, precise movements. Just then, a heavy tread on the gravel path announced a visitor, and soon our stout Martha Hudson stood at the door, a basket of fresh eggs in her hand and a furrow of concentration on her brow. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes, but I've been turning something over," something old Blackwood said once. He spoke of the Pilgrim's Path, a track the old folks say is walked by ghosts. He said the real treasures weren't at the end, but in the watching of the journey itself, remarked Martha Hudson. "And this path, Martha, where does it begin?" Sherlock Holmes noted. "At the chalk pit, sir, by the old stile where the adders like to sun themselves." "That's all I know of it," Martha Hudson answered. An hour later, we stood by the very stile Martha had described, the wind whistling past our ears as it swept across the downs. It carried the scent of salt and wild thyme, whipping at our coats as we gazed out at the vast, dramatic canvas of racing clouds. Before us, a faint trace in the turf snaked its way into the rolling green hills, the forgotten Pilgrim's Path. From a botanical perspective, Holmes, the landscape is remarkably uniform. We have fescue grass, some scattered hawkbit. It is a textbook example of chalk grassland ecology. If Blackwood left a trail, it is not marked by any obvious floral anomaly that I can discern, remarked Dr. Alistair Reed. He would not mark his trail for the common eye, Doctor. He would mark it for a naturalist. "Look here," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes pointed with his cane to a cluster of stones beside the path. To me they were a simple, chaotic jumble of flint. He knelt, his long fingers tracing their arrangement. "These are not random, they mimic the constellation Draco. Blackwood, the quiet student of the heavens as well as the earth, is telling us to follow the dragon's tail." He possessed a most methodical and poetic mind, Sherlock Holmes noted. And so our strange pilgrimage began. We followed a trail visible only to the initiated. First, Holmes pointed out a rare lichen, deliberately cultivated on the north face of a sarsen stone. Next, a carving on a gatepost that seemed a simple farmer's mark was identified by Reed as the stylized wing of a peregrine falcon. Then we found a line of yarrow, planted where it should not naturally grow. With each discovery my admiration for the deceased taxidermist grew. This was not the work of a madman, but of a genius, hiding his legacy in plain sight. The trail ended at a solitary, ancient yew. Its trunk, split and blackened by a long-ago lightning strike, stood like a grim sentinel on the highest point of our walk. The ground here was soft. Holmes began to probe the earth at its roots with his walking stick, which soon struck something solid with a dull thud, taking turns with the small trowel from Reed's botanical kit. Our breaths misting in the cool air, we worked at the soil. The sharp scrape of metal on metal soon echoed across the quiet downs, and before long we had unearthed a tin deed box, heavy and sealed with wax. Later, back in the warmth of our rooms, with the fire crackling in the hearth, Holmes carefully broke the seal with a satisfying crack. He lifted the lid. Within, resting on a bed of dried moss, was a large, leather-bound portfolio. Holmes placed it upon the table with a reverence I had seldom seen him display. He untied the leather straps and carefully opened the cover. The pages within were filled with meticulous script. They held breathtakingly detailed drawings of insects and birds, and complex, hand-drawn maps of the surrounding countryside. Good Lord, Holmes, this isn't merely a journal, it's a comprehensive ecological survey. The work of a lifetime, I'd wager, replied Dr. Alistair Reed. It is his true testament, gentlemen. A scientific argument for the preservation of this land, written in the language of nature itself, replied Sherlock Holmes. He spoke with a quiet intensity, his eyes still scanning a map overlaid with cryptic data points. The portfolio was a work of profound dedication. Of that there was no doubt. Yet, as I looked from the delicate watercolour of a butterfly's wing to the grim reality of Mycroft's telegram still lying on the mantelpiece, a cold question settled in my heart. Could a book of maps and moths, however brilliant, truly stand against the brute force of a railway and the determined greed of Jonas Asquith? Professor Morley's office was a testament to a mind in turmoil. Books lay splayed upon the floor. Papers overflowed from his desk in a chaotic cascade, and the air hung thick with the scent of stale pipe tobacco and defeat. The only sound was the frantic scratching of a nib against paper, which ceased abruptly as we entered. Morley looked up, his face pale and drawn. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, testament to countless sleepless nights. Without a word of greeting, Holmes strode to the desk and laid the leather portfolio upon the only clear space. The sound of it landing, a soft but heavy thud, seemed to echo in the profound silence. Morley stared at it, as if it were a serpent. Holmes's voice was not unkind, but held a firm, clinical edge. Professor Morley, I believe this belongs to a joint enterprise. An enterprise Mr. Blackwood called his true last will and testament, observed Sherlock Holmes. The professor let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, burying his face in his hands. The tremor in his shoulders spoke of a complete and utter collapse of his spirit. His voice was muffled, thick with despair. It is worthless now, all of it. Asquith has seen to that. He painted me as a charlatan, and Ephraim, he painted him as a madman. The council dismissed our preliminary findings, out of hand. They called our survey a fantasy, a roadblock to progress, replied Professor James Morley. Then you must tell us, man, said Dr. Alistair Reed. Dr. Reed leaned forward, his voice urgent yet gentle. What precisely was this survey? What was Blackwood's true purpose? Responded Dr. Alistair Reed. The direct question seemed to steady him. Morley took a slow, deliberate breath, the despair in his eyes momentarily replaced by the focused light of a scholar. He looked past us, out the dusty window pane, as if seeing the Sussex downs of years gone by. He began to speak, his voice gaining its old academic authority, as he recounted the history of his secret work. For 5 years, he explained, he had collaborated with the man the village knew only as a reclusive taxidermist. Blackwood, with his intimate generation-spanning knowledge of the Downs, had been the field expert, the silent observer. He had meticulously documented the decline of butterfly populations, the disappearance of native orchids, and the subtle shifts in the migratory patterns of birds, all things no one else had bothered to notice. He wasn't merely stuffing birds, you see. He was preserving a record. Each specimen was a data point, the portfolio that is the synthesis of it all. It is a scientific baseline for the entire region. It is proof, irrefutable proof, of what will be lost if Asquith builds his blasted quarry, Professor James Morley said. Holmes had opened the portfolio and was now laying its contents across the desk with a reverence that surprised me. Exquisitely detailed maps, charts of rainfall, lists of flora and fauna annotated in Blackwood's spidery script, and photographs of landscapes now threatened, all spread before us. Holmes tapped a specific chart, his finger tracing a downward-sloping line, his obsession with the Chalk Hill blue butterfly, which his nephew cited as proof of insanity. It was no obsession, gentlemen. It was an indicator. Its decline, as documented here, directly correlates with the degradation of the grasslands. This is not the work of a madman. It is the work of a brilliant, methodical naturalist, replied Sherlock Holmes. A renewed wave of hopelessness seemed to wash over Morley. A faint creak from his chair was the only sound he made for a moment. And for what? The counsel is in Asquith's pocket. They will never look at it. They will bury it, just as they buried our reputations. We are finished, replied Professor James Morley. Holmes gathered the papers with a crisp, energetic rustle that cut through the room's gloom. He straightened up, and in that moment he seemed to grow in stature, his eyes alight with the fire of battle. The game I saw was far from over. It had merely entered a new and more daring phase. His voice rang out, sharp and clear, banishing the shadows. Then we shall not present it to the council. You are thinking of this as a legal document to be debated by provincial bureaucrats. It is not. It is a scientific testament, and it must be delivered as such, declared Sherlock Holmes. Morley and Reed looked at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning hope. Holmes did not give them time to question. We will bypass them entirely. We will convene a panel of our own, men of science, members of the press, and officials from a higher authority than a compromised village council. Sherlock Holmes pointed out, we shall present Blackwood's vision not as a challenge to a will, but as a gift to the nation. The town hall loomed, a formidable chamber. Dark wood panelling and high, dusty windows dominated, the afternoon sun casting long, accusatory beams through the stillness. I surveyed the assembly of local grandees, their faces etched with suspicion. At the head of the table sat a chairman whose stony expression promised little charity, while opposite, Jonas Asquith fidgeted, his avarice barely concealed. Yet I felt no unease, for I had seen Holmes command a hostile room many times. He stood beside a small table, Blackwood's portfolio arranged with surgical precision. He began without preamble, his voice clear and sharp, cutting through the expectant silence. Gentlemen, you have been led to believe that the last will and testament of Mr. Ephraim Blackwood is the product of a deranged mind. You have been told it is a nonsensical puzzle. I am here to demonstrate that it is, in fact, one of the most lucid and forward-thinking documents this county has seen in a generation, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He lifted a hand-drawn map, its details rendered with an artist's care. The rustle of heavy paper was the only sound, as every eye fixed upon the unexpected competence of the work. This is not the work of a madman. This is a meticulous survey of the chalk streams, charting the decline in water levels over 2 decades. These charts here show the corresponding disappearance of the mayfly, and these, the subsequent decline in the trout population. It is a chain of logic, an ecological equation of cause and effect, deduced Sherlock Holmes. Jonas Asquith scoffed, a short, sharp sound of contempt that revealed the petty nature of the man more effectively than any argument. Doodles about insects. Trifles, I say. This proves naught but my uncle's obsession, his utter detachment from the world of practical men, answered Jonas Asquith. Holmes paid Asquith no mind, his focus absolute. Then I witnessed a remarkable shift. Setting aside the maps, he picked up a small leather-bound journal. His demeanor softened, the clinical edge of his voice giving way to a solemn quality I had seldom heard. He was no longer the logician, but the testator's advocate. Perhaps Mr. Asquith would prefer we examine not the data, but the man's own words. Let us hear the trifles that occupied Mr. Blackwood's final years. He writes, June the 4th. I walked the dew path to the high wood. For the first time in 50 years of observation there is no sign of the speckled moth. The new gas lamps in the village draw them to their deaths. We have traded a small wonder for a convenience, and no one has marked the exchange but me. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. A profound stillness settled over the room. I watched the landowner's stern expressions cloud, with something akin to wonder. Holmes turned a page, the faint crackle of paper echoing in the silence, and again. September the 10th. They have ploughed the old meadow. Where the bee orchid grew, there will now be winter wheat. A necessary crop, they will say. But where does necessity end, and simple greed begin? We are erasing the very manuscript of our land, page by page, and I fear I am the only one left who can read the old script, remarked Sherlock Holmes. He closed the journal gently, the action carrying the weight of a final pronouncement. The chairman, who had sat rigid, cleared his throat, his gaze fixed upon the portfolio, his earlier skepticism melting away like frost in the sun. I saw in his eyes a dawning respect. Mr. Holmes, this is extraordinary. This is not madness, it is a vision, remarked Chairman. It is sentimental nonsense. The man was unsound. The will is invalid, Jonas Asquith said. Asquith's voice was shrill with desperation. Holmes finally turned, fixing him with a stare so cold it could have pinned a butterfly to a board. It was a look I knew well, reserved for those whose greed had crossed from the contemptible to the unforgivable. Unsound. The only thing unsound here, Mr. Asquith, is your claim to a legacy you neither understand nor deserve. Mr. Blackwood did not leave his fortune to a riddle. He left it to the future. He left it to the one person he knew would comprehend his life's work. A person who would not see a meadow and think only of profit, but would see the orchid and understand its true worth. His testament was a test, and you, sir, have failed it spectacularly, Sherlock Holmes said. The chairman struck the table with his palm, a single, decisive thud that echoed like a gavel's fall. Asquith flinched as if the blow had landed on him directly, his face crumpling in on itself. In that instant, I knew the game was over. Enough. I see no grounds to challenge this will. On the contrary, I believe Mr. Blackwood's work requires our immediate attention. We must form a committee, a preservation society for the Downs. His legacy must be secured, responded Chairman. As the meeting dissolved into animated discussion, their voices filled with a new purpose, I saw Jonas Asquith slip from the room. He was a man defeated not by law, but by the quiet truth of a dead man's passion. Once again, my friend had done more than solve a puzzle. He had given a voice to the silent hills and secured a legacy for the soul of the Sussex Downs. A fortnight after the affair had been so satisfactorily concluded, Holmes and I found ourselves standing upon a high crest of the Sussex Downs. The wind, a keen and cleansing force, swept up from the channel, carrying with it the scent of salt and chalk and wild thyme. Below us the weald stretched out in a patchwork of greens and golds, a landscape that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Beside us stood Miss Emily Fairfax, her face turned into the breeze, her expression one of quiet triumph. It will be called the Blackwood Preserve. His name must be remembered not for the bitterness of his life, but for the beauty he sought to protect, Miss Emily Fairfax replied. Her voice was firm, imbued with the same passion that had convinced a panel of skeptical old men. From her satchel she produced not a legal document but a map, hand-drawn and annotated with the habitats of the Adonis blue butterfly and the nesting sites of the stone curlew. For a moment only the rustle of paper and the distant carolling of larks broke the silence. A most fitting legacy. His nephew, Mr. Asquith, saw only eccentricity and madness. He could not comprehend that a man might value the flight of a bird more than a stock certificate. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes had his hands clasped behind his back, his hawk-like profile etched against the vast cloud-strewn sky. He seemed less a creature of Baker Street's fog and gaslight, and more a natural element of this ancient land. They called him Mad, Watson, because his logic was not their own. Madness is chaos, a discordant symphony. Blackwood's testament was the opposite. It was a composition of immaculate order, a final, elegant classification. The riddle was not the product of a broken mind, but a key precision cut to fit a single lock, the mind of another who shared his singular passion. He did not leave his fortune to a name, but to a spirit, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Later that evening, back in the warmth of our cottage, the scent of Holmes's pipe tobacco mingling with that of the beeswax from his hives, we entertained our final guests in the matter. Dr. Reed, his face ruddy from the evening chill, sat by the hearth, a teacup balanced on his knee. The gentle clink of the porcelain against its saucer was a comforting sound. Even Martha Hudson, our steadfast housekeeper, had been persuaded to join us, perched somewhat shyly on the edge of her chair. I saw Ephraim Blackwood in his final days. He was frail, yes, but his eyes were as sharp as any naturalist's. He spoke of the changing world, of the motor cars frightening the badgers from their sets. He felt he was a relic, and he put his faith not in men of his own time, but in the future, answered Dr. Alistair Reed. The doctor's tone was thoughtful, carrying the weight of a man who had seen much of life and death in this quiet corner of England. Martha Hudson then cleared her throat, her hands twisting a handkerchief in her lap. He was a good man, in his way. Gruff, but good. He gave me a mounted starling for my mantelpiece once, said its colours reminded him of an oil slick on a puddle, and that there was beauty in that too. I'm just glad his wishes were seen through, Mr. Holmes. I truly am. Martha Hudson answered. Indeed, Mrs. Hudson, observed Sherlock Holmes. He offered her a rare, gentle smile. He rose and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to gaze out into the deep Sussex night. The fire crackled in the grate, a warm counterpoint to the profound silence that lay over the countryside. London gives us the complexities of the human herd, Watson, the crimes of passion, greed, and desperation. But here one finds a different sort of puzzle. The slow, inexorable logic of the seasons, the quiet battles fought in the hedgerows, and the enduring testaments of men like Blackwood. There is a deep and ancient wisdom in these hills. It is a grand thing to be a small part of it, observed Sherlock Holmes. He let the curtain fall, and the little room seemed all the warmer and brighter against the vast dark canvas of the downs. For the first time I felt I truly understood his contentment in this place, and I knew that the case of the taxidermist's testament would remain with us, not as a memory of crime, but as a lesson in the quiet and often hidden nobility of the human heart.